Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Braille Literacy Live. This is going to be our Braille Literacy Live Ask the Expert series with Diane Wormsley. We're so excited to have her share her expertise and her passion for what she does in terms of her I Am Able program and Braille literacy overall. I'm Jackie Awa. I'm the educational consultant in the outreach department at Maryland School for the Blind. Like I said, I'm delighted to have you all here. Wow, Diane Wormsley. She began her teaching career at the New York State School for the Blind. She's taught in Australia and Papua New Guinea. She was the assistant professor at Illinois State University, assistant to the dean, College of Health Sciences, University of Wyoming, an educational specialist and regional director for the American Foundation for the Blind. She was also the program director and associate professor at Pennsylvania College of Optometry, which is now Salus University, and the Brenda Brody Endowed Chair and Professor in Special Education at North Carolina Central University, and she retired in 2015. In her retirement, she has served as the executive in residence at the American Printing House for the Blind. She's the former editor-in-chief of the Journal of Visual Impairments and Blindness, now the associated editor. She is currently an adjunct professor at the University of Pittsburgh. Her publications include Braille Literacy, A Functional Approach, Braille Literacy Curriculum, and I Am Able, the Individualized Meaning-Centered Approach for Braille Literacy Education. She co-authored Foundations of Braille Literacy and co-edited Instructional Strategies for Braille Literacy. She has published numerous articles on her research, including the ABC Braille Study and Braille Literacy, and has presented on those topics at conferences and workshops around the world. Among her past awards are the Alan J. Koenig Research and Literacy Award and the Holbrook Humphreys Award from Getting in Touch with Literacy, the Mary Kay Bauman Award, and the C. Warren Bledsoe for Instructional Strategies for Braille Literacy, both from the Association for Education and Rehab of the Blind and Visually Impaired. Oh, so exciting to have her. I wanted to let everybody know that there's a chat feature that I would like to review with all of you today. It's on the bottom of your screen. If you move your mouse cursor down, you can see it. And there's also accessibility shortcut keys that can be found under settings if you need them or want to learn more about them. You can go ahead and press that chat button to ask your questions if you haven't done so in advance. And as we're going along, if you have a question, I'll kind of be acting as a moderator and I'll read those questions. So if everybody would take a minute real quick and just type using the chat feature, the county or state you're from, your years of experience, any other information you would like to share. And to keep things flowing, I'll read your introduction and question. So let's go ahead and take a second and do that so we can kind of get a sense of where everyone is from. We know we have somebody from Homer, Alaska, and that's Brenda. We have Michelle from Florida. She's not a TVI, but that's okay. We'd love to have her. We have Christine from Illinois. We have Philippa from Vancouver, British Columbia. Ellen from Utah. Annette from North Carolina. Amanda, Boston area, recent graduate. We have Charlotte Cushman from Pasta Literacy. Beth Peters, gosh, they're coming up so quick. Iowa, we have Jennifer, consultant for the Braille School.
Hey,
Wanda,
Angela, NCCU.
we have Emily at TVI right here from Carroll County, Maryland. Cheryl from Canada. Lori from near Vancouver, Canada. Wow, excellent, wow. This is great. So there were two questions that were asked. One was from Colleen Donaldson and one was from, I believe, Amelia. The first question is, Oh, we have somebody from the Mary Kay from Avon, New York. The first question was, any advice on teaching pre-Braille, beginner Braille skills to a first grader with multiple impairments and many behavior issues who knows the names of letters of the alphabet but does not know how to read or write? I've introduced A, B, and C and visual Braille. She's done flashcards with tactile stickers and put silly putty in the correct cell in a muffin tray, but that's about it. Any advice on methods would be super helpful. And then I'm going to go on and read the next question, because Diane's going to kind of cover these questions in her presentation, but please feel free to ask questions using the chat feature. We want this to be something interactive. So the second one is from Colleen Donaldson. This webinar is my first in-depth exposure to I Am Able. As I read the sample Kindle book, the key components of your program are quite appealing. I work with a beginning Braille reader who can write every letter, name, and some words. However, the student struggles with proper hand and figure usage when tracking and reading Braille. The student is beginning to scrub letters within words. What suggestions can you have that would assist this child? How would I begin to use key vocabulary with this student? So I'm going to let you go ahead and take it away. Thank you so much.
Okay, so the questions that were asked, I'm going to try to handle them, but if I don't get to a part of them or something, just let us know and we can get back to those questions. But I think what I'm doing today will cover most of them. And believe me, the word in-depth, this is probably not in-depth. I can go on for 3 days, 4 days, as many days as you want on I Am Able and still not feel like I've covered it all. But I think what I'm going to start with today is the most important thing to me about I Am Able as an approach and how it differs from traditional approaches. And then we can answer some questions about kids that you think might benefit from it. I'm going to apologize in advance. My voice is a little bit sketchy. I don't know if it's pollen or grandkids' colds, but hopefully I'll get through it. I've got a couple cans of Diet Coke here and some cough lozenges to help me through. So hopefully it won't be too grating on you. So the first thing I wanted to do is just point out the word I am able. It's I-am-able. And the I stands for individualized. So right off, you know that this is different from traditional approaches because most traditional approaches are pretty much one size fits all. Everybody does the same thing, reads the same words, reads the same passages in the same order. I Am Able is nothing like that. It is totally individualized according to the student you're working with. So that's the big I in I Am Able. And then the next letter is M, and that stands for meaning-centered. And again, this is a difference between most traditional approaches and I Am Able is that most of the traditional approaches you'll find start with learning the letters of the alphabet, how to read them, how to write them, what they sound like, how to put them together into words. And so it's more of a skills-based approach, whereas this approach starts with what's meaningful to the student. And in most cases, what's meaningful to your students are not letters, because letters really don't have a meaning and words do. So we start with the whole word. So, you say, okay, it's a whole word approach. And there have been whole word approaches in the past, and people have used it with Braille successfully. But more lately, you'll find most of the approaches that you would get access to for Braille readers are going to be more traditional, more skills-based. So when we think about skills-based, what we think about is teaching the letters, what they sound like, putting them together into words, recognizing the letters. When you think of meaning-centered, what I think of is what background of knowledge does this student bring? What words are important to them? What activities have they done that are important to them? What's their language like? What are their likes? What are their dislikes? Who are they? And I want to be responsive to that part of them to get them into reading. And when I go into the principles of I Am Able, the first one we're going to talk about is just individualization. Because for these kids that we work with who just aren't succeeding in traditional approaches, they're generally not based on something that they know. They may even feel reading doesn't have much to do with them. So then the next thing, in terms of starting with whole words, again, this is different from the traditional approach where you generally start with letters and decoding. So the words that we start with are the most important part of the approach. And figuring out what you're going to teach a particular student means that you're really having to get to know that student and find out what they're interested in. This is where background of knowledge comes in. What do they know? What do they like? What's fun? What's meaningful to them? And those are the words that you want to start with. And in the book, which I'll just hold up now, and at the end I'll tell you where you can get this if you don't already have it. It's available on ebook as well as in print. So these meaningful words are not the same as the kind of words we often see being used when people are using a whole word approach with kids who have additional disabilities. They often think of using the power words or frequently used word lists that are anywhere you turn. Go to the internet and put in power words or frequently used words and you get those words. But if you look at those lists of words, you'll realize that most of them aren't very meaningful. And, for, of, yeah, there are a lot of prepositions, there are a lot of nouns, but there are a lot of words that are just repeated over and over again. It, the, and so it isn't necessarily a good list to start with a kid who isn't necessarily really engaged in learning to read as it is. So the words we pick are picked for the student based on student interest. And so this becomes what we call a whole to part approach. Generally, when we think about teaching kids who are visually impaired, we think about part to whole, because we think it's easier for them to find something small and put it together and make something big out of it than it is to take something big and break it down. But in this case, I think the reverse is true. The students that we work with know the words that they know and they know what they mean, and so we start with those words. So it's essentially paying attention to the student. It's a student-centered approach, whereas most of the traditional approaches are pretty much teacher-directed. That doesn't mean you aren't controlling what's going on. As a teacher, you're very aware of what your student needs to learn. You're very aware of how you're going to use this approach to fit into all of those things that they need to learn. And I should say, because we're not going to get into this today, that every part of a skill that you would find in a traditional approach will get addressed at some point in I Am Able, because it has to. But it doesn't have to be the beginning part of it. And so I'm not skipping over phonics. We're not skipping over teaching writing. We're not skipping over letters of the alphabet. It's just we're not starting with them. We're starting with the whole thing that's meaningful to the student. What this means is that the teacher, you, who is going to use this approach with your student, has kind of an additional burden of figuring out what your materials are going to be. And Brenda, I'm thinking of you saying, I want materials. Well, you're going to probably be the one developing the materials, because most people aren't going to have them at their beck and call, but you can help other people get started. The other thing we do is we start with contractions right from the beginning. We include contractions in the words, so you really have to know your Braille contractions right from the beginning if you're going to teach using this approach. It isn't the case that you can learn the contractions along with the student, because you never know when a student's going to ask for a word, and you have to know what contractions go in it. So just, that's just a heads up for you right from the start. Then the last thing I'll say about this overall, before I talk about just the principles themselves, is what it means is it's unscripted. There is no book, not even this book, that's going to tell you exactly what you're going to do today, tomorrow, and the next day, and 2 weeks from now, and 3 weeks from now, and 4 weeks from now. You're going to have to learn to be responsive to your student and find out, as you diagnose what they're learning and see if they're having difficulty with something, how you might modify it, how you might change it. There are many different components to the approach, and you don't necessarily have to do them in order. Writing can be introduced at the same time you're teaching reading. You might not be doing it in the same way. But what it means is that it's scary, because I know most teachers, when they start this, say they feel like they don't know what they're doing. And I've had teachers describe it to me as a roller coaster ride, you know, which is exciting and fun, but scary at the same time. And it's fun to watch the students make progress. For me, what I get the most enjoyment out of is the times I've been able to work with teachers and see them get excited about this, because their students are beginning to learn when they weren't learning before. So I think that's overall the differences between this approach and traditional approaches. And just before we get into looking at the first component, not the first component, but one of the most important components, figuring out what the words are, I just want to talk a little bit about what I consider essential elements of this approach. And the first one, of course, is individualization. I mentioned that already. One of the things when you individualize, and you do this when you're responsive to students, one of the things that happens is they begin to get more engaged in their learning. Sometimes teachers have said behaviors which existed before they started I am able disappear as the student gets engaged and then is more motivated to actually learn to read. It may not happen all the time, but often it does. One of the other principles is motivation, trying to make sure that what you're teaching is motivating for the students so they'll continue to be engaged. And then the final principle is that you build success into this process. So you're constantly waiting and watching to see when a student has learned something well enough for you to maybe test them on it with another word or another word or another word or something else. And you don't test them until you know they can be successful, especially at the beginning. As they get more and more confident, more engaged, more motivated, more successful as they're working, you can begin to think about not worrying so much about that element. But I think success is so important because so many times we're working with kids that have not had that success. They don't have that confidence in themselves, and they're the ones who are least likely to succeed in learning to read unless we do something different. So I have those. Any questions on general?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, my apologies. This is from Annette. I work with, I think that's 8 to 5-year-olds, of which includes excuse me. Let me start that over. I work with birth to 5-year-olds, of which includes pre-Braille skills. But between 3 to 5, some students get into learning Braille letters. Am I wrong in saying that I should start with letters? Annette, if you want to talk a little bit more about your question, please do so.
I think I get it, actually. And if I don't, Annette, you can tell me. But we talk a lot about pre-Braille skills. And all of those skills that we talk about do not necessarily have to be taught in isolation, nor do they have to be taught before a kid is introduced to learning words. And I think that's one of the things we get hung up on sometimes, is that we think if we don't teach them all the letters before they begin to read, then we're somehow delaying their reading. Now, kids who are normal learners are going to be able to learn to read with traditional approaches. They can also have fun with an approach like I Am Able because it brings into reading things that they're interested in. But it's not necessary for you to use any one approach with any particular student. You kind of want to be able to mix and match. If you've got a kid who's really going gangbusters with learning letters and decoding and reading, the thing I would just say is also pay attention to what they know. What are they bringing to this? What kinds of past experiences have they had? Because so many of our kids, as you know, don't have the same background of experiences. They don't have the same concepts, or their concepts they're odd in terms of their development of concepts. So we need to pay attention to that in pre-literacy activities to make sure they're learning about the world around them. They're learning the concepts that are going to help them later on when they're reading. They're getting understanding vocabulary that's being used and that kind of thing too, just as much as we need to worry about letters and sounds. So even with the traditional approaches, if they're working with kids, I think you need to think about how they differ from kids who are sighted in terms of learning to read. Does that help?
Yes, that helps. Thank you.
Okay, good. Okay. Anything else before we move on? So the first thing we need to do is we need to start thinking about assessing these kids. If I started with assessment, I'd be going on until the end of the hour. So I'm just going to tell you that your assessment is going to consist of what they already know in terms of reading, in terms of letters, in terms of sounds, and the kinds of things that you would probably call pre-Braille skills, even though we might not be teaching them. But you can utilize their knowledge when you're teaching them using I am able. So you need to figure out, with the help of other people, parents, the student himself or herself, teacher aides, the teachers in the classroom, people who know the student well, and by observing the student. That's one of the best ways to figure out what are they interested in. What kind of a word would really turn them on if you gave it to them as a reading word? So you need to kind of collect a list of those words, and then you're going to figure out how you're going to, which ones you're going to use first, because you got to start with one word and then you go on to another one and then another one. You can't just stick with one word the whole time. So in the past, observation has been one of the best ways that we have discovered what words are important to kids. But again, if you keep in mind that you're being responsive to the student, you're going to be paying attention to what they do when you give them a word that you think they're interested in. And I'll give you just one example. In my workshops, I always tell about this little student who his teacher thought that bus would be a great key vocabulary word for him because he loved riding on the bus. He talked about it all the time. They had a story they had written about the bus. They had songs that they had sung about the bus. And so she created her word cards and gave him the word bus, and she told him what it was, and she had him feel the word, and he felt the word once, and he picked it up and he put it in his finish box. What did that tell her? Not a key vocabulary word, despite what she thought, despite all of his excitement about riding the bus. So I happened to have the chance to observe her working with him, and she was singing the song that they had written together about the bus. And when she would get to the part where she would go beep, 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 this kid would just jiggle like jello and laugh and shake. And I thought, So I said to her afterwards, it was about time to leave for the day. I said, try beep, beep. She said, is that a word? I said, sure, you can write it. I'd put a hyphen in it, I guess, and see how he responds to that. So the next day I get an email from her and she says to me, I didn't know he had a 15-minute attention span. But she'd made multiple word cards of beep beep and she gave them to him and he would read them and giggle and laugh and say beep beep and put it in the finish box and pick up the next one and read it and laugh, and then he wanted her to read it. And so it was, her comment to me was, now I know what you mean by a key vocabulary word. And I've had other teachers give me similar kinds of reactions of kids to words that they thought would really be important to them and they weren't. So you don't have to stick with those words. In fact, be careful that you don't stick with them, because if they're not meaningful to the kids, that's going to turn them off. So once you collect, I'd say 10 to 15, 20 words that you think are really meaningful, important words for the kids, then you are ready to start using them in teaching them to read. So you notice I didn't talk about letters. I didn't talk about contractions. I didn't talk about what the word is. One of our students asked for a lot of unique words, including colonoscopy. When she got to the point where she was selecting her own words, they were not your typical beginning reader words, but they were words that had some meaning for her and words she wanted to know more about. So, and I always love that. You know, colonoscopy to me is one of the worst things you could undergo. And she picks it for a key vocabulary where it's like, oh, okay. All right, so any questions?
Yes, we have 2 questions. This is from Amanda. She asked, how would you introduce words the student is interested in if they cannot read words in print yet? Should you, and I don't know if she meant to say Braille or not, should you start with the Braille word or make sure they can read the word in print first? So she didn't mean that. If the student is sighted.
So is this student, I would assume, Amanda, is a dual print Braille learner? And you can type your answer if you can't speak it.
Yes.
Okay. How old? Second grade.
Second grade.
All right, I'm going to give you a viewpoint, which is mine, which is that if she has some vision and has been learning print, most likely she's learning Braille because she has a deteriorating eye condition. I'm assuming that's right. Is that right? And people are concerned that at some point. So my feeling is you got to get Braille in there fast. Second grade, she's getting to the point where they're going to start using print and Braille for reading, exclusively by the middle of 3rd grade, end of 4th grade. So you need to get her up to par fast if you can. She doesn't have to have seen it in print. Doesn't make any difference. A print doesn't really relate to the Braille that much. If she wanted to learn it in print and Braille at the same time, you could certainly do that. But the important thing, if she's going to be a Braille reader, is for her to see it in Braille. So I think that's where you start. And you have very limited time with her. There are other people who can teach her print, but you're the only one who can teach her Braille. So again, those are biases you're going to get from me, but I feel very strongly about them. So anything else? Any other questions? My nose is itching too, so.
Amanda says, thank you. And then we have another question from Elizabeth Peters. Can you address tactual defensiveness? Suggestions to motivate kids to touch the Braille? Yeah,
I think tactual defensiveness is something we hear all the time. And sometimes it comes from being pushed into touching something that they're not interested in touching or being afraid of it. I have seen examples of kids who don't like to use their hands, and all of a sudden the teacher will say, I have a word here for you, and that word is, and the hands come up and go on the Braille because the word is attracting them to wanting to see what it is. So that's another way you can tell whether the word is really important. The other thing you can always do is say, I'm going to feel this word. And it's a word I think is really something you're interested in, and I'm going to put my fingers on it now. If you want to ride my fingers, you can. And try to make it a very safe situation for them. I'm hoping that once you address it in these ways, the kids will be less tactily defensive with the Braille itself. They may still be with other things. Like if I had my hands pushed into a science experiment and I didn't know what I was going to be feeling, I might be a little bit leery too about that. So I'm not saying it's not a real thing, but I'm saying there are ways that we don't say they're tactily defensive, therefore they can't touch Braille. We say they're tactily defensive, therefore I have to figure out a way for them to feel safe touching the Braille and for them to be motivated to touch the Braille. Does that make sense to you guys?
Oh, that's great. I like that.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Okay, great. Anything else before we go on?
All right. I don't have anything at this time.
Okay, so we'll keep going. So for just a minute, I want you to think of 2 words that might be really, really important to you if you were going to learn Braille, and just keep them in your head while we're doing the rest of this. So take a couple minutes and think. What words would I really, really, really want to read if I lost my vision tomorrow? What would it be? IEP? Probably not. Diet Coke might be one of my words.
Somebody had said their name.
So instead of saying my name,
Chocolate.
say your name. Put your name down, because that's the word you want. You want your name. I wouldn't say my name. I'd say Diane. Chocolate is in, yes, of course. Coffee? Anybody? We're all going to have different words. Lori has a question here we'll get to in a minute. Pizza, candy, dog, dance, coffee. Haha, is that a word or is that a reaction? Could be a word, haha. You can keep typing them, and I think what I want to do is answer Lori's question before it goes off the screen. She said, would you say that this program is an alternative for kids for whom the traditional Braille reading program or for kids with multiple disabilities? Yes, that's how I originally set it up. And people have used the whole word approach with kindergartners just for fun. And it certainly doesn't have to be used exclusively. You can use it in conjunction with traditional approaches. But I think for the most part, the kids that we've worked with have had kids with additional cognitive disabilities to begin with, and then now we're getting into kids who are autistic, kids who have English second language, and hyperactivity, and all sorts of other things, because our kids are not simple. Conchita says, I've used it with typically developing students that are English language learners. And we have too. But we've also used it with English language learners who had additional disabilities as well as visual impairment. So when you're thinking about the approach, you can be thinking about the kids that you're working with and whether or not you might bring it in as an additional tool or whether you might focus on it exclusively. I think because of its ability to motivate and engage students, if kids are learning Braille after they've already learned print and maybe have the need for Braille now, it's a way to get them into it that's a lot more fun than trying to decode, which can be very painful and slow and just, you know, as a teacher, when I used to listen to kids learning to read that way, my stomach would just cramp up on me practically. All right, so you have your words. And now what we're going to do is look at them, and we need to initially pick a word, a couple words, 3 words that are very tactily distinct from each other, because we're not paying attention to the letters. We're paying attention to how these words feel in Braille. And so if I had cottage and coffee, both of them start with C and O, although the OF is in there, so that makes it different. But I think that I would try to avoid words that start with the same letter, avoid words that are the same length, and in Braille, not in print, because be careful, some really long words in Braille, or some really long words in print can be short words in Braille. And the first word we want to be the one that hopefully is the most exciting for the student. So as you're looking at the words that you might list for yourself, you could be thinking of which one would I introduce first, and then what would I introduce next in terms of making sure that the second one is really super distinct from the first one, so that tactily I can talk about it and the student can feel the difference almost immediately. So a really long word and a really short word, or one that has lots of open space as opposed to one that has a lot of dots in there that you can then talk about with the student. And then you start designing your flashcards. And I make multiple flashcards for each word. I want the student to be able to take some home, and I want them to be able to play games with them. I also don't want them scrubbing the word down so much that they can't feel it. And so we start with, maybe 10, 20 cards per word to use when we're teaching that word. So we create the flashcards in a very specific way. The first thing we do is we don't just put the word in the middle of the flashcard, because what that encourages the student is to start moving his hands across the card and trying to find the word, and by the time they get to it, then they might be scrubbing up and down on the first letter. You want to give them a way to find the word that has them moving left to right in the direction they'd be reading. So we use lead-in lines and lead-out lines to get to the word. Lead-in lines, dots 2, 5, right in the middle. So if you put your finger so that that's in the middle of your finger pad, you should be able to find that word and just keep going. Then what is a word? How do you know you have a word as opposed to the end of a word or the next word? How do you know? What is it that tells you it's a word?
The space.
A space before the word and after the word. So if you don't put the space in, you're not teaching your student that words have spaces. So you need a space after that lead-in line before you put the word in. And let me tell you, whenever I do this with groups in a workshop, I look around the room and the number of people who forget the space because of the way we're doing it. It's a lead-in line. It's not another word. They wouldn't leave out the space if they had the other word, but sometimes you forget it with the lead-in line. So just remember, you have a space before it, you have a space after it. We do 2 5s after it as well to lead out to the end so that their fingers keep moving. And that's what you want to tell them. You want to tell them, keep your fingers moving across the word. Keep your fingers moving across the word. Don't go up and down on it. Don't scrub. You have to watch their fingers. You have to make sure they're not scrubbing. And if you do, you will develop kids who can read across the word with smooth tracking. Part of the reason is because you're not asking them to stop and tell you what the letters are. If you ask them to stop and tell you what the letters are, you will see scrubbing up and down with the finger. It's easier to feel Braille when you're going up and down than it is when you're going left to right. We should have designed it so it was written like this, but we didn't. Anyway, so again, lots of cards for each word. And when you give them the word, you tell them what it is. No guessing games here, because we already know they had difficulty perhaps in learning to read. We don't want to test them. We want to teach them. So we are telling them what it is. This word is coffee. And I bet you like coffee when you get up in the morning, don't you, Elizabeth, or whoever? And so the word coffee is on this card. Let's feel across, and you tell me when you find when coffee starts, because the lead-in line will end and the word will begin, and then keep going until it ends and the lead-in line goes out. So let's just look at it several times. Let's see if we can pick up anything that you might feel about that word. Kids aren't going to tell you anything initially. They're just not. Even adults who do this, they start saying, oh, it just feels bumpy. I don't know what I'm feeling. So then you start analyzing the word itself and saying, okay, what does this word feel like? Which means you got to have it in Braille, and you got to have it under your own fingertips to feel what that Braille word feels like. And so then you have to translate it into a kind of language that your student, at whatever level he or she is, will understand. So short is fine, but you don't know what short is until you've seen long. Lots of dots means there's just no empty holes here at all. Or maybe you've got a line that goes up and down. As you move across it, you feel that come underneath your fingertips, and it's straight up and down. If you take like the word lollipop, and I mentioned that in the book, because it's got L-O, L-L-I, P with an up and down line in it, O-P. It's got all those up and down lines, very tactily significant. So what you're beginning with is words that are grossly tactually distinct, each from the other. Obviously, the more words you get, the less tactually distinct they're going to become. And so you're going to have to pay attention to other things in the word other than length, other than lots of dots, you may get into letters at the beginning at that point because it's the only thing that's going to keep you from telling one word from another. Baseball from basketball. Boy, oh boy. If the kid wants sports, those two words look a lot alike. So you have to really focus on that difference between the two of them, which is right there in the middle. And what I think of when we talk about how the words feel with the student is I call this the language of touch. Because what we're doing is we're coming up with adjectives that describe how Braille feels to the reader. And it's something that we've never talked about that much in our training. As a teacher who went through a traditional university training program, we didn't have a course on teaching Braille. So we had to kind of figure it out for ourselves. And that's where this came from, trying to figure it out. All right, so questions? Oh, somebody said basketball and baseball. How do you, I'd wait to teach them. You could teach one, but I'd wait to teach the other until I know they have a lot of words under their belt and they're feeling confident, because that can be really, really hard. The only other thing I could do is take ball off it and say, let's look at basket and base. Now there's where there's some differences, right? So maybe I'm going to talk about the fact that basket is a longer word than base. And basket has a K in the middle of it. K is a really, really distinct letter. And it's very open because there's like a dot on the top, a dot on the bottom, and nothing on the right-hand side. So B-A-S-K, and then the E is up at the top. And then there's that T, and you aren't going to feel anything like that T in baseball. So I might wait until I've gotten enough under the kid's belt so that I know I could talk to him about some of those things without making him feel unsuccessful. But it's going to depend on the words you have. But do you see how that might work to take ball off the end? And now you've got ball, and you've got basket, you've got basketball, you've got base, you've got baseball. All of a sudden, you have 5 words that the kid has learned. Any other questions?
I don't see any.
You don't see any? Okay. So if you've taught the first word and you've gone over it with the student and you've given it to the student multiple times, you really aren't going to know whether or not they can recognize that word unless you give them another word, right? So one word doesn't cut it. At some point, you got to bite the bullet and bring in a second word. So you bring in that second word when you feel like the kid is giving you an indication. This is so unmeasurable, I'm sorry, but he's giving you an indication that he's able to recognize this word. He understands what it is. He's reading it well. His fingers are moving across it. He says it when he comes to it. He talks about things that are important in terms of how it feels, or he gives you an idea that it feels that particular way. And so now let's bring in a second one. So we had coffee to start with. Anybody got another word which would be fairly distinct from coffee? Yellow. Okay. I think that's good. Now, coffee has the OF in it, and another F and an E and an E. So at the end of that word, its letters are up at the top, aren't they, of the Braille cell. But with yellow, woo, what do we have in the middle? We have those 2 lines that go up and down right in the middle of the word. And at the beginning, it kind of is open. And then another line, because really that Y is like a big, almost a full cell. It's going to feel like lots of dots right at the beginning, whereas coffee is way up at the top and it has just 2 dots. And again, we don't have to talk about number of dots, position so much, but we can say the first one starts and the dots are up at the top. You don't have to say there are two. And this one looks like there are lots of dots at the beginning. And then as we move across yellow, we get those two lines in the middle. Can you feel the two lines in the middle? And again, when you're talking about how they feel, you want to make sure they start back at the beginning of the line, go all the way across and say, when you read it this time, see if you can feel that it's kind of full at the beginning. When you read it this time, see if you can feel those two lines up and down in the middle. When you read it this time, see if you can feel that ending OW, or you aren't going to call it OW, but that ending symbol where, you know, there's a little bit of openness, a little different. So you're talking about them again. You know the words. You tell them it's yellow. You tell them it's coffee. Hopefully it's not yellow coffee, although maybe it is. But you get into a conversation with the student about how the word feels. And so you don't talk about contractions. You don't talk about letters unless you know the student knows what a C is, or unless you know the student has had a contraction in a previous training, even though they're not necessarily successful readers, unless the student himself or herself says, oh, that's an L. And then you say, oh, fantastic, that's really great. Okay, so there's two L's in the middle of that word yellow. That's all you do. You just go with that. You don't have to take them into, yes, it's Y-E-L-L-O-W. Focus on what it is they're bringing to it. So it's very different from the way you would start with learning the letters of the alphabet and trying to decode them based on their sounds, right? Okay, anybody here say they don't believe it would work? Because let me tell you something. If you don't believe it will work, you won't do it the way it's supposed to be done. And you know what? It won't work. You have to believe. And if I had a bunch of teachers here, I could give you lots of testimonials, but I won't. Okay.
I do have, if it's okay if I interrupt you, since you were kind of at a stopping point there, I do have two questions, and I also wanted to let you know you have about 10 minutes.
Good.
Okay, so I have a question from Gretchen. She just is on her phone, so she'd emailed me. My question is for a student with a visual impairment that has difficulty using two hands due to motor difficulties. How do we encourage the use of two hands? Student tends to leave one hand in lab, or do we just teach the use of one? Thank you.
You try to teach the use of two until you feel like maybe the student's getting frustrated or something. We've had kids who had just one hand that they could use, but the other one, it wasn't so much that they couldn't move it, it's just that they weren't used to using it. So what we have found is that if you try to get them in a position where it's easy to use that hand, and that sometimes involves getting a PT or an OT involved and saying, how is it easiest for this student to read the Braille and make sure both hands are on the page? And so you can always say, look, you know, you don't have to necessarily feel it. Just let it ride along or follow along or see if you can do that. Again, try it. If you don't try to get both hands engaged, you won't. If you do try, you still may not, but you'll have a better sense of whether you can. And then you will decide whether I just give up on that hand or not. But you have to try it first. And you encourage it simply by saying, okay, let's put both hands up there. We got to get them both up there and wait until they've got both of them together, and you figure out how it is easiest for them to feel that. Does that make sense? Gretchen. And Gretchen's emailing in, so we'll have to wait and see, I guess.
And then this is from Ellen. She asks, are you spending the same amount of time producing the keywords on the Perkins Brailler as you are reading them?
And by that, I'm not sure what you mean. I'm going to spend time producing the keywords on the Brailler for the student to read. I'm not going to ask them initially to produce the keywords on the Brailler, because when I teach them to write, I'm not necessarily going to have them write those words. I may have them pick a favorite letter or a favorite contraction and start with that. Or I may have another way of teaching them to write, and then bring those keywords in at some point when they're capable of doing it. But if I taught them letter by letter using keywords, that would, to me, be very frustrating for a student and time consuming. So they need practice on the Perkins before you're going to write it. So, am I going to be spending the same amounts of time producing them as I am reading them? The question is kind of, I don't know how to explain it except the way I did. Does that help? Okay, great. Anything else?
I think we're good. I think we're
Okay.
good.
So I've got, what, 8 minutes? So,
7 minutes.
okay, so what I'm going to say is that starting off with Braille, with two hands, involves something more than just the word cards and the desk. And that is, if you're going to read Braille with both hands, how do you keep the card from moving? And if you can't, what's going to happen? The kid's going to put his hand down to hold the card and read it with one hand. So if you do not have something under the card that secures it, you can't teach the use of both hands in reading. And not just under the card, but if you've got a sheet of Braille and you're reading a big story, if you don't have it secured so that it doesn't move, then what happens? Pretty soon you'll watch and the kid will just be reading with one hand. So we get tacky, really sticky, tacky shelf liner anywhere you can find it cheap. You don't have to get fancy, dice them. All you need is tacky enough so that the card doesn't move and it isn't dirty. So, because when these tacky things get dirty, they slip. So whatever you can find out there, go to your dollar stores, go to Ollie's, go to anywhere they sell shelf liner and feel it. And take a card with you and see if you think it's going to move. And then get yourself a whole roll of it. I had a teacher who found this absolutely wonderful stuff, and I lost the resource. But she found it in like a hardware store or something, and it covered the whole kid's desk. So not only did his cards not move, nothing on the desk moved. It was where he put it. It didn't slide off, which was fantastic. So if I were to see a video of you and you didn't have that underneath there, then I would probably write you and say, where's your shelf liner? Or I might say, go look at your video and see what's missing. Because you'll see that the kid isn't able to read with both hands smoothly because he's concerned about the paper moving. So that's another thing that's really important about your initial introduction of words to the kids. Don't short shift. Get that tacky shelf liner and put it down and have it with you at all times. And somebody said they've also used carpet tape with one side rubber and one side sticky. But can you take the card off it easily? That's the thing. If the card sticks to it too much, then you can't move the cards. Because when I give kids cards, I'll give them the stack of cards. I'll put it in front of them and say, pick one and read that one. And that one is the word such and such. And then the next one is the same word, but you pick it and you read it again. So they're reading and they're organizing their environment at the same time. So I want them to be able to pick up the cards and read them one by one. So we are at 5 minutes out, and I want to make sure everybody has a chance to think about what we've talked about. This is just one piece of I am able. I will share my email address with you if I can find it on here. Can you see it? The book, I Am Able, that I showed you earlier is from APH Press, APH took over AFB Press books. And so they're selling them now. And I believe that the I Am Able kit is available on Quota System, but I'm not sure about it yet. But in either way, you can get the publication or the kit from APH.
Laura, real quick, had asked, can you talk about combining words as sentences?
Ah, okay. Well, once you get a few vocabulary words learned, say 3 or 4, you really can write a simple sentence with them. And what you're going to do is bring in, so these are key vocabulary words we've been working with so far. What you're going to bring in when you start putting words together is either you'll put words together that fit together and form a different concept, or you might want to make a whole sentence, or you might want to create some stories around those words. In trying to write the stories or the sentences, you need some additional words. What you need are those filler words, those power words, those words that are repeated over and over and over again. And when you do that, you provide the sentence for the student, you read it to them, you tell them there's some other words in there, but you've got some of your key vocabulary words in there too. Or they may tell you a sentence they want to read, and you write it for them. But eventually, you have to get from words to connected text where kids aren't going to be reading. And then you go over what they've read and have them read it over and over and over again until they, you're pretty sure they can also recognize those filler words. And at that point, we take the filler words out of those sentences and give them their own word cards. And they become part of the words the kids practice on when they're rereading and relearning their words, because kids need to continue to practice feeling the Braille. Braille, the sensitivity to touch is more fading than visual perception. You see something, it's easier to remember what it looks like. When you touch it and read it in Braille, it doesn't last as long. So you need a lot of practice on those word cards and continued practice on them. And that can be done like, okay, let's read through your cards that we have today before we start our lesson. Let's go through them all. After they know them, after you know they know them. And if they miss one at that point, you say, oops, guess we need to spend more time with him, huh? So. Okay.
Well, it is 4 o'clock. I want to thank everyone for their participation. Diane, thank you for sharing all of your information. Just so greatly appreciated. There's a survey. If anybody's interested in a contact hour, they can complete that survey. I've posted it. Once again, thank you. We're getting lots of capital thank yous. And we are wrapped up. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks to everybody. It was fun.
Thank you.
And write me.
Yes. Oh my gosh, she's wonderful. She really wants feedback from everyone. She loves to share her knowledge about this program or this strategy.
All right. Talk to you later.
Oh, and this will be available on MSB Outreach's YouTube page. It just might take a week as long as the recording went well.
Thanks, Jackie.
Oh, would you mind typing your email? She's already off.
No, I'm not.
Can you type your email address real quick in the chat? I think it was dpwormsley@gmail.com. Somebody had just asked. Thank you.